artificially like this? Two things. One, well, what do we know from basic economics? The lower the price of the things given, the greater will be the quantity demanded that people want to buy of that thing at that lower per unit price. And in this case, the price of borrowing. So it stimulates the demand to borrow. But on the other hand, as the rate of interest is pushed down in the marketplace by the Federal Reserve, a central bank, increasing the amount of money available for lending purposes in the banking system, that destroys or reduces the incentive for people to want to save as much. And therefore, the people's willingness to save out of income goes down. Okay? Now, what is the effect of this on the economy? Well, the Federal Reserve has created money. The banks use this extra money to induce additional lending by offering the extra supply of newly created money at a lower rate of interest. Borrowers borrow that newly created money and spend it as demonstrated into an attempt to increase their investment demand. Okay? They're demanding an increased supply, quantity supply of investment goods. I want to expand investment. Or in the case of the U.S., it also included the long-term investment of more housing. The low rate of interest stimulated people to want to buy houses. And how do you supply more houses? You devote resources to making a long-term capital good called homes. And that tended to push the prices up of capital goods, including housing, and attempt to increase the quantity. But it also had this other effect. And what was that effect? The lower rate of interest induced people to save less and consume more. And what happens if you save less and consume more? Your demand for consumer goods rise. Okay? And that means that there's an attempt, and by spending money, to demand more consumer goods. So the price of consumer goods are being pushed up in an attempt to increase the quantity of consumer goods. But you know something? You can't move in two directions at the same time. Because now if we extend this to our production possibility frontier, investment spending is being stimulated from 0 to Q2, which means there's an attempt through investment stimulus to devote more resources to investment activities. How much of the society's resources? Not to I1, but to I2. In other words, an attempt to shift resources into investment activity and less into consumption activity. But what's also happening here? People are saving less and consuming more. And this means there's an attempt with saving less to consume this much. But you cannot be at point A and point B on the production possibility frontier at the same time, right? If you all remember that. It is inconsistent with the available real supply of resources, raw materials, existing capital equipment, and labor to produce that much consumer goods, plus at the same time that amount of investment goods. Something's got to give. It's an old song. And finally, what has happened in 2007 and 2008 is something had to give. The bubbles of attempting to housing expansion, investment spending, greater consumer spending, and consumers even now with the attractive rate of interest trying to expand their consumer spending even more because at their lower rate of interest, the attractiveness of borrowing more for consumer spending on credit cards, for example, consumer debt. And finally, with the economy trying to be pushed in two directions at once, which are inconsistent with each other, cause the bubbles to burst. And that is what caused this crisis. Okay? With the collapse of the financial markets, the decline in housing in many parts of the world, consumers finding themselves overstretched with the amount that they committed themselves with borrowed money, things that they bought. And now the economy has to correct. What does the economy have to do to correct? It has to go back to here. The economy has to be allowed to bring all of these interconnected and interrelated markets back into equilibrium. So that how much is consumed and how much is saved is in balance with how much is planned to be spent on investment goods, given the availability of the society's resources to do one or the other, or some particular combination. You can't be trying to have this much consumption and that much investment at the same time. The society is not wealthy enough for that. Okay? And as a consequence, we have this crisis. Now what happens, the economy has to be allowed to adjust. And what does that mean? People have to modify their consumption spending, pay off their debt. Housing, too much housing was constructed, and prices were pushed too high. Too much investment spending of various types were undertaken, and some investment projects cannot be completed, or have to be delayed to completion, or some will be found to be totally non-profitable and they'll have to be written off. But that means that some prices have to come down to restore equilibrium to the X marks the spot of the black supply and demand, and the rate of interest has to be allowed to rise to bring supply and demand of savings and investment back into balance with consumption and investment spending and the available actual supply of resources in the society. But what have governments around the world done? They've done the exact opposite. They haven't allowed the market to work. What has the central bank in the United States and Europe done? They've attempted to try to keep this investment and housing market restored, to bubble it up again. How? By increasing the money supply. In the last year or so, the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, has increased our domestic money supply by $2 trillion. $2 trillion. That's a lot of money. And they've pushed interest rates practically down to zero. In fact, if you adjust for inflation, some leading or prominent interest rates in the U.S. were during the previous boom and are now once again negative when adjusted for inflation. In other words, they just give money away for free. In other words, they're creating the same scenario that created the crisis to begin with. And therefore, this apparent recovery of the stock markets, like the American stock market, European markets, Asian markets, is in fact a similar beginning of an artificial set of bubbles that eventually will end up bursting again. And it's due to the fact that the very monetary authority, the central bank, that's supposed to see that booms and busts, inflations and recession don't occur, is the instigator of these things. Instigator of these things. What then is the best policy? Well, it's the same best policy as when looking at any markets that are out of balance. The government should basically step back and let the market adjust. Because there is no way to know what the right prices are. What is the real proper pattern or balance between supply and demand, other than what the market enables us to discover. Big Brother doesn't exist with omniscient information like God about what the real relationships are, what the proper prices are, what is the right relationship between supply and demand. We're mortals. We operate with a vision and a perspective a lot less perfect and omniscient than God's. We only know what the right supply and demand is, what the prices are, through the process of the competition of the market. And that is what the government is preventing. And therefore, it is creating the illusion of a recovery that I fear, from my understanding of these things, is setting the U.S. and perhaps the world economy for another bursted set of bubbles down the road. Now, nobody has a crystal ball. And I know economists often create an arrogant sense that they know what's going to happen tomorrow. But they don't. But like causes bring about like effects. And if the Federal Reserve and other central banks are doing the same things that set in motion the first boom and bust, then their repetition of that is setting the U.S. and the global economy once again for a cycle of a boom and a bust. What has been happening is like the following. Johnny goes to